So hello from me. Uh, we are going south. First of all, again, thanks for the organizers to make this event because right now are difficult times and really it's rare to have live events. A few words about Bulgaria and the situation in Bulgaria. We are one of the regions which is really projected to be most vulnerable to climate change in future. What we can see here, it's one of the many maps produced in the climate adaptation strategy for Bulgaria, which is brand new. And all these red and pinkish color are actually forests that are expected to have some problems with drought in future if the forecast really is as it is expected. And we can see that pretty much of the territory of the country is expected to experience some drought stress, at least the forest. Only the really mountainous territories are expected to have enough moisture, which is quite a challenge. Recently, we had several projects in our country, mostly run by NGOs with the support of the Southwestern State Forest Enterprise. And they were focused on different questions related to climate, to future climate, how the species will behave. What you see here are two maps, slide after slide, where we can see thermicity index, one of the index which shows the heat over the terrain. And we can see here the base climate, which is what the trees are used to. And the next slide shows the forecast for future. And the change of color really shows quite much new conditions, especially in the lowlands, in the southmost part of the country. We expect completely new climate conditions in future, something which is typical right now for the region of Athens in Greece, completely new climate for Bulgaria, which of course will mean probably new species composition. And this year we had another project which was focused already on building a much better database for the Southwestern Forest Enterprise and modeling how species actually at what locations the species are situated, with what variation in climate, soil parameters, everything. And finally, with this data, we fitted the MaxScent models. These are models which predict where the conditions are best or not good for certain species. What we can see here are certain graphs for example, in that case, it's Picea abies, one of the most popular species we are talking about. In Bulgaria, it's a mountain species. It's not so widely distributed. And feeding these data into modeling, actually, how it looks like. The map at your left, you see the actual distribution of these species in Bulgaria. With red are the locations where the species is with higher participations, with yellow with lower participation. And at right, you see actually the modeled best climate conditions for these species. Of course, the model is not exact because we have quite larger territory than the actual territory. The reason, of course, is that in many locations we have competition from other species which are better adapted for the specific conditions than spruce. But the question is that we use this approach to actually see how the suitability of different terrain changes in future if the climate really changes the way it is expected. And here we see this. To the left is the ecological niche of the species for the climate which is kind of base climate, the climate in which the trees grew, and the nowadays forests reflect this climate. And to the right, we can see the future condition. And the green colors are kind of good conditions for the species, and the yellow colors are already somewhere in the middle, and red is something that is completely not suitable for this species. And we see dramatic reduction. Actually, it's not several times, very, very big dramatic reduction, which means that these species will have probably huge problems in future. The only way it can escape this new climate is to go up, higher up. But higher up, of course, it will meet different challenges. For example, right now there is almost no soil above tree line, or the soil is very thin, or it's very steep, very rocky, which means that even if the climate conditions are suitable for the species, it will not be able to really produce good forest. And this is quite a challenge for many species, which are right now the main species in our mountain subalpine forests. Generally speaking, we consider that we will have three groups of tree species based on this modeling and also on expert judging. The first group would be the gaining species, those who would be able to tolerate more drought, those who would be probably able to tolerate more higher temperatures, and these are mostly the Quercus species. Luckily for us, we have quite many Quercus species in Bulgaria, and also in Greece we have our neighbor country several more species which are even better adapted to drought conditions, which means that they can migrate potentially. Also the Carpinus orientalis and Carpinus betulus would probably benefit. And maybe surprising but not so much, Fagus sylvatica would also benefit, at least in the mountains, where it can be more competitive in locations where now spruce is dominant. The so-called losing species would be mostly those coniferous species which are much more sensitive to drought, especially Picea abies and Abies alba, but also in some locations Pinus sylvestris, also Pinus peuce, Pinus heodraichi, which are very rare endemic species which are with very limited distribution right now. We don't know how exactly they will tolerate the future conditions. And of course the plantations at low altitude, because we have quite many pine plantations which were planted in the 60s, too low for these species, and now they suffer very much. And potentially we have also a group of species which will preserve their role, although their role is rather small right now. These are species from the Acer, Praxinus, Tilia, Ulmus genus, which actually right now are usually found like single trees or small groups in our forest. They don't play so important role, and potentially they would of course also be able to be in our forest, but of course will not play much more important role in future. Several maps. This, for example, Pinus sylvestris. To the left is the niche, the calculated good conditions for the species, for the climate for 1960-1990, and we see quite large territory. Also in the lower mountains in Bulgaria. It is not suitable only for the very high or the very low altitude locations. And to the right we see quite reduced niche for the species, actually very similar to what now we observe with these species. Most of these plantations at lower altitude are right now dying. Pinus peuce, one endemic species for the Balkans, which is very similar to Pinus cembra, which you know from the Alps and the Tatras. Right now we have quite wide distribution of the species in our highest mountains. It is, together with spruce, the most important for the subalpine coniferous forest. But in future, these conditions would be much worsened. So the species would have to compete with those who come from lower altitudes, and also it would have to go higher up, which, as I said, would be probably quite difficult. Pinus nigra, one species that would probably not lose much, although it would probably not feel so well at lower altitudes. It would feel much better in the middle altitude in the mountain, where right now the Pinus sylvestris is better suited, but Pinus nigra would probably really be competing with Pinus sylvestris in future. And Quercus pubescens, we see the inverse picture. A species which is now not dominant. It is found in lower altitudes, but in future probably this would be one of the most important species for the lower altitude. It is really quite tolerant to drought. Unfortunately, it is not the best growing Quercus species, which means that we might have good forest with it, viable forest, but it will not be productive forest. Fagus sylvatica, broadening its ecological niche in the mountains and losing, of course, in lower altitude. This is probably one of the species that will be quite suitable for the forest, which is presently dominated by Picea abies. And are the only risk related to temperatures and precipitation? Of course not. We already had enough examples today, and this is one graph which clearly shows how much we have increase into salvage logging due to sanitary reasons. And these blue bars are damages caused by wind, snow, ice. We have dramatic increase of those in the last year. So it's not only biotic, but also quite much abiotic reasons. And of course, with fires, we have quite much problem. You don't see the lower graph, unfortunately. This is the PDF file. But we have quite dramatic increase of fires in the last years in Bulgaria, in the last decades, not years. And we have to address this problem, of course, and the map that you see clearly is one of our new modeling for the risk of fire, especially in terms of risk for old growth forests and for protected forests. And we have a really quite increasing risk of forest fires, which might really be damaging for forests that we value very much. What can we do about it? We have some choices, and we really try to help our foresters. The first thing that I want to show is one tool in GIS, something which is available for our foresters in the Southwestern Forest Enterprise. And what I have circled with red and with orange is a list of species which we potentially will be much more suitable for future for this exact location. So the forester can click on his location and see what he has right now and what would be probably better for future. And if he, for example, sees this in the regeneration, he knows that he can tolerate these species as the potential species of future. Another thing is really a variety of measures to preserve genetic and species diversity. Not only structural diversity, but we heard a lot today about this topic, and we really have a lot of plant measures also in our climate change adaptation strategy to preserve the valuable landscapes, to preserve the old growth patches in the forest. We expect that these are the forests that really hold the genes for the most durable trees. Preserve the biotop trees and biotop islands within the manageable forest, which is quite hot topic right now in Bulgaria. Also search and preserve those trees which survive in hard times, which is really the genes of those trees who can tolerate harder conditions. Right now we have some mortality waves, but still we see that some trees survive even the worst conditions. And these are probably the trees that are the answer for the future. And probably we would have to support a lot because some species are at their edge right now, and if we don't support these species, probably they would disappear. Of course, we have quite difficult situations with our plantations, mostly pine plantations. You see on one of the graphs huge forest fire. And this huge forest fire took location in one of the dry areas in Bulgaria and burned a lot of pine plantation. And what do we do right now? We plant pines again. Is this okay? Obviously not. But Pinus niger is very easy to plant. And when you have risk of erosion, sometimes it's the only species that can be planted easily. But what about the future? If we create pine plantation there, in 10 years probably it will burn again. So this is not very good option. And even if it's very difficult to plant oaks, for example, it could be much more necessary. And another big questions. To the left you see one typical pine plantation in Bulgaria from the 1950s, 1960s. Obviously it has not been thinned up to this moment. Why? Because it's not economically profitable, and that's why it was left to the natural situation. And to the right you see one location in which you have very good oak regeneration under those pines. This is something which is happening quite often after disturbances in these pine plantations. And of course, this is one of the examples what we could do. And right now there are activities in many locations in Bulgaria where people try to do this, and also they look what happens. And of course, we have quite a problem with old coppice forest, because this is also quite much spread. In the old days, these were dominated by oak species, and they were managed in coppice system, and this means that we really have troubles with regenerating the oaks with seedlings, which is another topic, and it needs really support. And of course, we have these huge problems with forest fires, which means that we have to build capacity to discover these fires very quickly and to respond to these fires. It is a variety of measures. All of them are costly and all of them need a lot of measures. And I'm a little bit late, but thank you for the attention, and probably there will be questions for the panel discussions later.